Hello, I'm Bill Merrington. I'm the chaplain at Bournemouth University, and with me today is Gary Hazel and Abdullah Al Andalusi, and we're going to have a conversation together about life in Britain and how it relates to people who are from the Islamic faith. Let me begin today, and can I just say that we're doing this on behalf of Bournemouth University Islamic Society. So Abdullah, let me begin with you if I can. We hear a lot on the television, on the press, that Britain is a multicultural country. And the way it's expressed is that it's a country very integrated from many different cultures. Is that how you see Britain today?
Well, I would say that, growing up in Britain, I did experience that there are different cultures in terms of people from different parts of the world, different cuisines and food and so on and so forth. Although you could argue that in Victorian times that was already the case when they were bringing new foods and new cuisines over to the UK, including tea. But to some extent there is, there's this kind of a tolerance and plurality concerning different foods and clothings and so on. But at the same time, there are also issues with perhaps Britain struggling with an identity crisis as to how to define itself in a kind of post-secular world. And also, there are some, you could say, perhaps paranoias or tensions and issues regarding innocuous practices, like, for example, halal meat and things like this, and just Muslim congregational prayer, or just prayer. In some cases, women choosing to wear a face veil. It's not ubiquitous amongst Muslim women, but some, as a minority of Muslim women, choose to do so. And there's been some issues, even though it doesn't obviously impinge upon people's rights, doesn't impose upon anybody or force them to change their lifestyle. So in some senses, there is multiculturalism to some extent in the UK, but there are some issues concerning practices. And it's all tied into, I think, Britain's identity crisis and in a broader scope, Europe's identity crisis as to what defines British values. Should British values be defined? I mean, they were never defined before in the past as formulaic as some of the politicians like to talk about, it would seem. So there are some issues and these issues, obviously, we all have to work our way through them to find a amicable and peaceful resolution.
I mean, if you were thinking that Britain was a kind of, you get the picture of multiculturalism as if it's a homogeneous mixture, like a cake that's all mixed up. But I guess if we really look at Britain, we would find enclaves where people are living from particular other countries, where they've come to this country and have built their contact up in particular little towns and areas. Do you think that helps integration, or do you think that actually hinders Britain being more multicultural?
Well, there's been some long-standing enclaves in the British Isles, namely the Welsh, Scottish, and Cornish, if you want to include them as well. And some of them are very fiercely proud of their particular identity, their particular and distinct culture, distinct language. So in some aspects, Britain, we're used to having enclaves or areas of England where people have different practices or different languages, or even, someone might even say the Midlands and the South and the North-South divide is significant as well to some extent in just how lifestyle and attitude, mentality. So I don't think it's so much a problem. It's just rather the issue of people being paranoid about other groups, or for example, Jews live peacefully, amicably in Stamford Hill, traditional Orthodox Jews. And, there's no problem with them. No one has a problem with them. They're a peaceful and amicable community. And, if it's okay for them, why not people learn to live with other kinds of communities which have similar practices to Orthodox Jews as well? Don't want to, disrupt the society or force their practice on anybody else, but to live. And it's natural for human beings for us to kind of congregate around people of our own just mentality, culture, language, or so on. It doesn't mean that you're being divisive. It's just rather you're affirming what you believe with like-minded fellows. At the same time, when you go to your workplace, you're going to mix with people. No one can have segregation in the workplace. Jews, Christians, atheists, Muslims are all going to integrate, all going to mix together in the workplace, and that's fine. That's not a problem. But if people choose to live in certain areas, I mean, we already have it with the upper class. Upper class areas, the rich live in certain areas. You won't find, working class living in those areas. So it's just a natural feature of humans to say to force anyone to say you to live, in a dispersed way, saying you must, mix with everyone else and so on. It's basically to force people to do something that's not really an inclination. If they do it naturally, that's fine. But if you start forcing it, then you'll kind of come with a kind of almost a homogenous vanilla flavored society. Sometimes society is enriched by having differences and even different areas, which I think create a mosaic rather than just one bland colour.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand why people, when they come to this country, want to live with people similar to them. So, it is understandable. But Gary, let me turn to you. Do you look at Britain as a multicultural country that's working effectively together?
I'm not quite so sure we're working effectively together, but we're definitely a multicultural country. And when you consider how many different people from different backgrounds have come to this country, that's always going to be our future. And it's very unrealistic to suggest that anything else is possible. But what I would say is that multiculturalism only works when certain practices from one culture don't become a conflict or a threat to the rest of the culture. And that's what we have with certain components of either Islam or the cultures of the people that come from their countries.
What aspects of threat are you talking about, Gary?
For example, you mentioned halal slaughter, and you described it as an innocuous practice. I would say that halal slaughter, firstly, can only be done by Muslims because they say a Muslim prayer. So it's racist not to employ anyone from Britain.
Although that would be true for the kosher food as well, I guess, wouldn't
Sure,
it?
yeah. I mean, I don't particularly like kosher slaughter, but back to halal slaughter, I also consider halal slaughter very cruel to the animal. I mean, we've spent several hundred years developing an animal welfare system that's designed so that the animal has the least amount of suffering. And now, whilst having religious exemptions for halal and kosher, some might argue that that's necessary. And if it is, fine. But one of the exemptions on halal slaughter when it first started in England was that it would only be served to Muslims, the same as with kosher, their exemption.
Yes.
And that exemption has been ignored, and it hasn't been enforced by the government. Also, because of the exemptions on halal, they're able to produce a cheaper product, and to a certain extent, they've been able to undercut British suppliers. And we're at a stage now where 30 to 40% of the meat in this country is halal slaughtered. And a lot of the traditional British slaughterhouses that did exist no longer exist, or they've been taken over by Muslim businesses. Now, again, fine if that Muslim business is there to provide for that religious exemption just for practicing Muslims. I understand that your faith is important to you and practices within that faith, but I don't feel it should impact on the rest of us, and I don't feel it should have an effect on the rest of us. And also, the certification process for halal, you give money to charitable organisations, is that correct? Yeah, it is correct. And some of these charities have been linked to groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, which have also been linked to supporting groups like Hamas, etc. Now, when I buy something in a shop, I don't want to be supporting, possibly, somewhere down the line, terrorist organisations. Now, I've never called for the ban of halal slaughter. All I've asked for, and what I've campaigned for in the past, is that halal slaughter be labelled. So any meat or any product that's involved with halal slaughter be labelled. And I think that's a reasonable request. Also for Christians and maybe Buddhists and other people, some of them have expressed a concern that they don't want their food to be prayed over.
Yes.
And most of the halal slaughtered meat in this country is unlabelled, so we don't know that it's been slaughtered halal. So with respect, to describe it as an innocuous practice, I don't feel it's accurate.
Abdullah, I mean, would you, presumably, I assume you would probably not have any problems with meat being labelled kosher, halal?
Yeah, I mean, it's not really a problem whether it's labelled or not. For myself, if they want to label it, that's fine. However, I suppose there are some contentions I'd have with some of the concerns that were raised. Basically, if we have a sincere desire for animals not to suffer unnecessarily, right? So the key is to say unnecessarily. And so now we have methods like stunning, which enable us to not need to basically cause unnecessary pain. But we have food supplies, which, I mean, we don't need to eat meat. It's unnecessary for us to eat meat. We don't have to. If we truly are concerned with animal welfare, then we should embrace vegetarianism, right? If we really want animals not to suffer, I would think that we should arrange a trip for everyone that has an issue with halal to go to the normal slaughterhouses or the bulk standard slaughterhouses and see how animals are kept, treated, and so on. You'll see quite a lot of misery. In fact, it might even put people off actually having meat. So to raise this contention that, we care about the animals now, I find sometimes I can find among some people to be disingenuous, not everyone, but I find that some people, we're raising this now as an issue on newspapers and the media. I think it's kind of fear-mongering and hate-mongering and so on. I don't think it's racist to say that only a Muslim can produce halal meat. But a clarification, as Muslims, we can have kosher meat as well. So, I mean, as long as a monotheist has, kind of prayed over the meat and so on. Generally, kosher meat we can eat and halal meat we can eat. So it's not only for Muslims and so on.
Okay.
As for the meat, halal meat going in, I mean, as for 30 or 40% of the meat supply in the UK being halal produced, I would contest that. I find that, highly exaggerated figures and so on. It actually costs more to produce halal meat than it does to have it slaughtered by mechanically, because a person has to basically slaughter every animal by hand, whereas mechanically you press a button and all these poor animals are sent into a machine and are basically slaughtered mechanically and so on. So I would actually say it's actually cheaper to have normally produced meat. But I think what some businesses have done, because in some areas of the UK there's a high Muslim population, and these businesses want to take business away from competitors who are, let's say, for example, Muslim chicken shops, like halal chicken shops. So if KFC, for example, is because it might want to take business away from and attract more business for itself, that it will say, okay, we also offer halal meat. And I think as they kind of see it, is that, certainly Christians, even religious Christians and devout Christian opinions, even within the Bible, they can eat meat sacrificed to idols. So if they can eat meat sacrificed to idols according to majority Christian opinion, I know some Christians disagree with that, but how much less so would they have a problem with eating meat sacrificed to the one God, as kosher was done. So as for Buddhists, I don't know if Buddhists eat meat. If they're meat eating, I think they're more vegetarian, and religious Hindus also are vegetarian and so on. So I suppose that they want to eat meat. They're not really people that I would strike as having religious concerns. So I think that the businessmen of KFC and whomever decided to incorporate halal meat in some of their shops, just thought it would make good business sense to have halal meat, because generally speaking, no one's going to die from halal meat specifically. No one's going to be converted to Islam just by eating halal meat, where every chicken wing they're becoming more of a Muslim. So they thought, well, it's just meat. End of the day, if you're a-religious, if you're atheist, it doesn't matter what someone whispers in their mouth as they're doing their job, as long as they're doing their job to health and safety standards. So I don't think this is an issue. I do think that there is a concern with, as I said, this description of a threat. How is it a threat? Are people's restaurants being invaded by Muslims, and the restaurant owner forced at gunpoint to adopt halal meat, or people who are not Muslim forced to eat halal meat. Sure, about the issue of labeling, I mean, that would probably be the strongest argument that can be presented. However, even then, the issue of labeling, it is at the discretion of the business to do so. It's not like it's a chemical compound or something like this, which is I think like trans fats, which have to be, which are actually banned, I think, in Europe.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's some kind of controversial or illegal chemical compound. It's just meat to the average non-religious, non-practicing Englishman.
Because Britain has, in the last 50 years, adopted all kinds of food in our country, haven't we? From the pizza to the curry. So it is quite hard to work out what is British food these days. But perhaps that leads us into what is Britishness. The government recently have been saying on their bagwagon, in a sense, saying, oh, we need to identify and to get a more coherent message about what is British in this country, so that people who live here, whether they've been born here or they've moved here, can really embrace the British culture. Do you feel that there's such a thing as Britishness that can be defined?
Well, if you want to identify British culture by, let's say, the culture that we have today, or the way generally accepted culture or its most popular culture, for most of Britain's history, Britain hasn't been British. British culture, I mean, the Victorians would be aghast at what they see today as a British culture. In fact, I'd dare wager that the Victorians would identify more with Muslim religious practices and Jewish religious practices than they would with what some people may describe as a more hedonistic culture, possibly, or a more non-religious culture, or a more secular culture. Certainly, religion was very important and was very much part of British fabric of the UK for centuries, and has informed their laws, their outlook. Even the British language has been affected by the King James Bible and its language. And as I said, I actually have no problem with the traditional Christian foundation of the United Kingdom. I think that religion actually helps make a country better by giving it moral values based upon something concrete, not just something arbitrary as the saying of a politician or the proclamation of well-meaning moralists, but with no substance behind it, or the then exhortations to just be moral because it's nice. Yeah, sure, it's nice, but if you need to have some kind of foundation. So I actually think that Britain would be better being based upon a solidly, Christian foundation, and I think secularism has caused the problem we have today, and I think secularism has caused the identity crisis that we find ourselves today. This need for British values. No politician in the past has ever said or enumerated what British values are. There was no need to enumerate. Firstly, culture changes over time, of course, but it was just viewed that basically, by being a good, upright individual. In fact, many of the great English playwrights and philosophers have said actually being moral, being virtuous, this is what the characteristics of being a good Englishman. Not you have to stick your pinky up when you're drinking a cup of tea or other such quaint practices. So I think that what we face today is an identity crisis in a post-secular world where all kinds of meaning and moral value has been stripped away from states and countries, and it's left it empty. And now people are scratching their heads wondering, what does it mean to be in this country and part of this country and so forth. So I think this is a question that Europeans... I suppose
one of the basics would be language, for example. I mean, do you think everyone in this country who chooses to live here should be expected to speak English?
Well, ask the Welsh, the Cornish and the Scottish, I think, of that question. But you'll get some interesting answers depending on who you speak to.
But they also speak English as well as Welsh, or?
Possibly, although, I mean, in some places in Wales, I've had, they refuse to speak English and look down upon anyone that walks in their area speaking English. I have many anecdotes of friends of mine who've encountered that and were quite shocked by this. A country can have multiple languages, but what I would say is, yes, there's no problem with there being, you could say, a universal language for the point of interaction. And as I said, I speak English. It's my mother tongue. I don't have any shame that I speak English or it's my mother tongue. And I've tried to spend my life and my education trying to improve my understanding of English to better communicate.
Yeah. Let me bring Gary in here for a moment then. Just what do you think Britishness is? Gary, if the government's going to teach what is Britishness, what would it be?
I don't think a government can teach Britishness, really. Our values are based on the Judeo-Christian humanist grounding that our nation was formed on. It's down to politeness, manners, thinking of your friends, family and loved ones, sometimes quite often before yourself, thinking of your country and behaving in a way that's not always selfish, certainly in public, which is very different to some other countries. There are lots of things that make up the British culture. We could probably talk all day on the subject, but one thing I did want to talk about that Abdullah mentioned was that about values not being, because he feels, as a lot of people who follow a religion feel, that values should be based in the Bible or the Quran, or but I would argue that values are not based on what a politician says, as you mentioned, but our experiences over the centuries, what we've learned, what we've observed around us. We've learned that if you behave in a certain way, it has a positive outcome. It's the very nature of evolution, some might argue. And that's how we learn our values. And they, quite naturally, over the centuries, they will evolve. And when you have a book that was written 1,400 years ago or a couple of thousand years ago, I feel that sometimes some people who follow the religion, they're held back from evolving their understanding of the world because they won't evolve their values because they're stuck on what it says in that book. And I think that's dangerous. That's it really on values, I think.
Okay. Abdullah, we have very recently had a lot of publicity about the issues in schools, and that has focused, particularly in Birmingham, about pockets of areas that have, perhaps some might say, lost its Britishness, and in which people have tried to change the teaching within those schools to really reflect Islamic teaching. Do you feel that's appropriate within British culture?
Well, I think if you look at the recent so-called Trojan horse schools, some of them were previously rated as outstanding, by Ofsted, and they were high achieving. So they delivered in getting students to get good grades in their exams, and these exams aren't set by the school; they're set by examination boards. So you have to get those students to the level of understanding on their subjects to pass those exams, and these schools had been achieving that. So in terms of outcomes, values weren't holding back anybody in achieving their outcome. In fact, some might even say that the values were helping and motivating those students who were Muslim to excel. There was never any case in those schools where these schools were being hijacked by extremism or radicalism or any of that stuff. There was no proof at all regarding that. And instead, what was brought against some of these schools was that basically that some of their you could say some of their assemblies were having an Islamic flavor to it. And the argument was that, well, we live in a secular country and you shouldn't have this in schools. Of course, we have faith schools, and of course, what most people don't realize...
Some of them would be Church of England schools, in which mainly Muslims are going to them.
A significant portion of... in fact, the first schools in the UK were actually Church of England, so we have the Church of England to thank for that. But what people don't realize is that by law, which all schools which are not exempt or haven't got exemption from the government, all schools have to have some kind of collective worship which is majority Christian. It's part of the law. So there is a faith element, even by law right now to this day, whereby schools, unless they get an exemption from this, must have their services majority Christian. And of course, they allow discretion in schools to apply exemption. I think one of the schools in the Birmingham schools, their exemption had run out and they hadn't got renewed, and that was the issue that was taken up. Not that there was a faith-based service or assembly, but that it was in essence, in a way, the wrong religion possibly, because their exemption had run out. Now, I understand where that law came from. It came from obviously the Christian past of the UK, and the fact that the first schools were Church of England, so this was natural for that law to exist. But I don't think that, I think what we should look at, the real question is that were these schools, who the majority of their pupils were Muslim, surely these schools have to adjust their teaching style or a bit of the environment to cater for the needs of the pupils. It doesn't mean now that the non-Muslim pupils must have it forced on them. In fact, if I ever heard that non-Muslim pupils were forced to attend Muslim services or have Muslim faith forced upon them, then I would stand right at the front lines condemning that along with everybody else. But if it's just for Muslim students to have a bit more of their beliefs and their background catered for without going against the law, then I think there's nothing wrong with that. And of course, it doesn't affect their achievement. As Ofsted said, one of the schools was actually achieved outstanding results in its academic examinations and tests.
I suppose it raises this feeling that's come out is coerciveness, something going on underneath. Hidden was the Trojan horse that you're talking about. Is there things going on in Britain that's hidden, which is affecting our culture? I don't know whether, Gary, you feel there's anything going on that's not as truly open as you want in this culture.
If I may, I'll answer the point about the so-called Trojan horse plot. I don't think we should be naive as to call it a plot or use the sensationalized language that newspapers use, like hijacked or anything like that. But the fact is that there are a lot of schools in towns like Birmingham, Bradford, Luton that are run by Islamic organisations, and within Islam itself there are components that are extreme in nature. So what's bound to happen is these components will get through to the schools. And indeed, there are people within Islam, as there are within every culture, that lean towards these extreme factions. And for example, there was one chap who's on a watch list in America. Forgive me, I forget his name, but he was banned from going into America, but he managed to get into England, and he's now a governor at a state-funded school in England. Now, someone with extremist views like that running a school is not a good thing. It's not a good thing for the country or for the Muslim community.
So what bits of extremism within Islam are you talking about here?
The components of Islam that are a threat. For example, some people within the Muslim community might say that Sharia is what they consider to be important within Sharia is dominant over democracy, and democracy is un-Islamic. And some people might suggest that within the Muslim community that Sharia should even dominate the UK, and what they consider to be Sharia, a lot of Muslims might suggest Sharia is just their sort of internal rules that they give themselves to govern their lives so they can achieve their deen, taking into consideration the 5 pillars of Islam, etc., etc.
Yeah.
But there are some who feel that Sharia is something very different, and those people will get into schools because they want to reach the youth. They want to bring a new generation to their way of thinking, and that threat is very real. It's not something that I've imagined, or I'm not suggesting there's some organised plot from certain groups, although there may be, but there are individuals who follow that ideology, and the school system should look out for them. But within schools that are run just by Muslims, moderate Muslims in England have a tendency not to speak up when these people rear their head, and that's our experience. And I think that's a shame, because I would like to see Muslims stand up and say no to these people, people that we can all cheer for, people that we can look up to, and so that people within the Muslim community can integrate better with British life.
Yeah.
But as it stands, we very rarely see people in the Muslim community stand up to these kind of people, and that's a great loss to our country.
Abdullah, do you feel, obviously the recent news is about young Muslims going off to Syria or wherever to fight. Do you feel the Islamic society, the Muslim community in our country is really projecting a strong voice against that?
Okay, first and foremost, I don't think the US State Department and its ban list should dictate to us what is extreme or not in the UK. I don't think American policy should dictate UK policy. We are a sovereign country. We don't run off what their State Department tells us. So if someone is banned, there's a Canadian speaker called Shabir Ali who only does interfaith debates. He only talks about theology, nothing political at all. And he himself was banned from going to the United States and so on. So I don't think the United States is a good arbiter of what is extreme or not.
Let's leave America to Americans.
Yeah, all right.
But there is a question. I think Gary has this question, which is that people would like to see the Muslim community stand out and speak out more against some of the negative things and the negative press that we see going on within the world, within the Islamic world, where there is the fighting, the young people going out.
Well, there were famous English playwrights that went to the Spanish Civil War and fought against the fascist government in Spain. English people going to a Spanish Civil War and fighting, and they thought it was a good cause. No one called them a terrorist. No one said they're extremist. These are English playwrights, famous ones. So I think that, if you look at the Syrian situation, Bashar al-Assad is a secular dictator, very nasty kind of person, and how he treats his people, torture, execution, indiscriminate bombings, and so on of Syrian people. So I think that basically, I don't think people who want to go and fight against him, and some include even Christians, there are Christian Syrians in opposition to him, I don't think they are extremists or terrorists. I think that they're doing no different to what the English playwrights did when they went to, the Spanish Civil War to fight against fascists.
Is it healthy for the Muslim community that this is happening?
Well, the real question is it healthy for the Syrian civilians that is happening, that they have a dictator over them that has brutalized them for decades and arrested and imprisoned and disappeared thousands of people from the Syrian population. So I think that's the more fundamental question. And then the thing is this: if people, generally speaking, politicians have always waxed lyrical about the need for military intervention to get rid of brutal dictators in the past, and that's been totally fine. And except when it's not them doing it, or they don't control the agenda. Remember when in the war against Gaddafi, there were British people going to Libya to the opposition to fight against Gaddafi, but because the opposition from very early on had made a deal with Britain and various other governments that they would they were more under the control of Western governments, or suddenly it was okay. Suddenly there was no one ever was worried about radicalization, terrorism, or any of this. But when it came to Syria, when the Western governments couldn't control the opposition, i.e. by buying them off and using them as proxies, suddenly they're extremists and terrorists. So I think this double standards and hypocrisy is it just won't go, and we shouldn't accept it, and we shouldn't be fooled into this narrative which is kind of spun around us.
If I may, let's be clear: to go abroad and fight in any field of war in any other country is breaking the law in this country. It's against the law. So the fact that you would stand there and sit there and say that that's okay, that's abhorrent to me, and that's exactly why I support the EDL and why I'm with the EDL, because we stand against violent jihad, not only in our country but abroad.
But what's abhorrent about going to another country to defend the weak and defenseless against an oppressive dictator? This country's done it many, many times before.
Sure, but
albeit to those they declared to be brutal dictators, they've used that same justification. And great English playwrights, I believe, was it George Orwell and Bertrand Russell, I believe, went to in the Spanish Civil War, fought against fascists. Right? They have volunteered.
What are they replacing Bashar Assad with? They're replacing him with the violent jihadist ideology that's wrong.
Well, says who? What says the British government? Says your speculation on the matter? No, the Syrian people don't want to replace one a dictator with another kind of dictator, the same ilk. They actually want a government where they feel that they're not afraid of anyone. They're not subject to arbitrary detention and arrest. Many of the groups, and they are Islamic groups, are offered that, and that's what pulls many people there, including Christians. And there are Syrian Christian groups in the opposition. It's not just it's just a Islamic jihad thing. There are Syrian Christian groups who are fighting in the opposition against Bashar al-Assad because he was a threat and a tyrant to everyone. Not just to Muslims of one particular ilk in Syria. So I think it's high hypocrisy. As for the British law, as I said, I don't tell people to go to Syria. My only point is, morally speaking, you can't condemn it as being immoral. What you can say is that the British law has been changed to mean it's illegal. But if that's the case, then 50, 60 years ago, would the EDL support the prohibition of homosexuality, because that was against the law, in this country. So must we follow the law, right or wrong?
The law.
I know, but if the EDL did exist back then, is the principle "my country" right or wrong? Is this what we're going to do? No, we talk about morality, right? We're not talking about law here. And morally speaking, it's no different to the fight against fascists in Spain, the Spanish Civil War.
I feel that the Islamist ideology that the jihadists follow is close to fascism. So yes, it is immoral, and yes, it is wrong. And I don't think that Syria will be a better place if they do defeat Assad. I would love to see, in another country, I would love to see Syria ruled peacefully by people represented by the people. But it's what can we in this country
is your
do
worry?
to affect
Syria
that?
is very complex, and there are Muslims and there are Christians fighting on both sides.
Sure.
But if we bring it back to our country, Gary, is your fear that that kind of jihad would happen here one day?
Yeah. Well, it already has. So yeah.
In what sense?
7/7, Lee Rigby, etc. English people died in America and New York. I'm sure English people died in Mumbai, etc. The whole world has felt the effect of violent jihad. And whilst I certainly respect the fact that most high majority of Muslims probably don't support violent jihad, it's also fair to say that jihad is central to Islam. And it's also fair to say that Islam today probably wouldn't exist as it is if there hadn't been violent jihad. So to suggest that, that even though most people don't follow it, it's not part of Islam, it's just false.
Well, let's see. Abdullah, is jihad really central to Islam?
Firstly, people would say that Britain wouldn't exist if it wasn't for just war theory, which is the Western equivalent of jihad. Jihad, best translation would be just war. And people praise the army and say, without the army, without them conducting many wars, Britain wouldn't exist. So
you excuse one wrong?
No. To say that basically that without jihad, X, Y, and Z wouldn't exist. I mean that is basically true for most countries. Without a defense or without a force that fought for justice, no just country or no country that at least claims to stand for justice would exist in the world. In terms of the issue of, and this is the problem, the issue is you judge the opposition of Syria based on what? Have you spoken to them? Have you had any evidence about what they actually say, what they detailed the Sharia out to be? No, you've gone by what the newspapers have told you, by what pundits of particular political persuasions have told you, and they have coloured your understanding of what the Sharia is. And this is the real issue. It's not really the war itself, but rather it's about the causes of the opposition and of most opposition, which is obviously they want an Islamic system. But the Islamic system, they don't view it as it's not a totalitarian system anyway. They view it, in practice, in history, and with precedents. They view it as a state that frees them from arbitrary rule of a dictator. It gives rules that protects them from oppression, and most importantly, non-Muslims are not under Sharia. Even historically speaking, Christian communities, Jewish communities, they had their own law courts, their own system. They even had their own semi-autonomous areas where they could live according to whatever they wanted to live by. So in that level of multiculturalism doesn't even exist in the West. That level of plurality doesn't exist now in the West, but it was granted because Sharia is only for Muslims. It's not for non-Muslims. And as for those people, you mentioned, you said that Muslims don't speak out against extremism in the UK. The issue is this. The problem is not that Muslims don't speak out against extremism or extremists in the UK. The problem is the media keep going to these, these obscure individuals.
We live in an internet age today.
Yes, but you know what? News of the World and the Sun front cover paper is not the internet age, right?
So help us to know then, Abdullah, how Muslims are speaking out against injustices.
Well, I mean, basically, Muslims have always openly and vocally condemned all injustices, whether they were perpetrated by Muslims or non-Muslims or whoever. It's just that no one will give them the time of day to hear this. Scholar after scholar after scholar has condemned terrorism, has said that we can't use this as a viable tactic. Some Muslims who like Osama bin Laden, who borrowed a leaf out of America's book and even Winston Churchill when he said they bombed civilians, so we can do it too. And we say no, we do not borrow from other people. We don't. We follow what the Sharia says. Osama bin Laden himself admits that he's contravening in his speeches especially in an interview to Al Jazeera, I believe, in 2002. He admit that basically Islamic law says you can't kill innocent women and children, but he said it's not set in stone. I believe it is set in stone. I believe that 1,400-year-old book cannot be changed. And Osama bin Laden wants to change it, or wants to change rather the commandments of it. I believe it can't be changed. And it's because I adhered to that book 110% that I condemn terrorism. I always have. But people like me and those who are way above me, the scholars and the great thinkers of the Muslim community, no one will give them the time of day. The BBC, the Sun, the Daily Mail will not go to them to get their reaction from the latest outrage. They will go to one or two particular individuals of whom we know so well, and they will ask them, and these people will say deliberately things to make everyone as angry as possible.
Well, Gary, you might have the same complaint about the press, of course.
Can I make a point on that? A politician that I'm a fan of, Nigel Farage, we mentioned earlier, he gets attacked in the press on a daily basis, and so does this party, yet they've just won a national election because of the internet. Now, the internet is a great tool for free speech and for people who want to pierce the veil of the powers that be that control this country's narrative. Now, if you have a problem with the powers that be that control this country's narrative, use the internet and other such tools and campaign vocally and get your voice heard. It's very possible to do that, but we don't see any of that from Muslims in this country.
So just a question, when was the last time you Googled Muslims condemning terrorism?
I don't know.
You see, if you don't search, you won't find. Seek and ye shall find, I believe, the maxim. You'll find it. But if you don't go looking for it, you won't find it. And if you build your opinion on something which you haven't even at least tried to see if it does exist, you won't find. If you Google it, I'll guarantee hundreds of thousands of results, thousands of scholars, notables and personalities. After 9/11, after 7/7, you couldn't go into a Friday congregational prayer every Friday without a condemnation of terrorism, a strong one issued by the imams. So we've gone out of our way to condemn terrorism, to assure the non-Muslim community of what is actually Islam, what classical and orthodox Islam stands for, and also what classical and orthodox Islam stands for is also obeying the laws of the country or not breaching the laws of the country. So as Muslims, this is what the Sharia says. This is what the classical Sharia says, not a modern or a liberal interpretation. The classical understanding of Sharia is that as Muslims, if we go into another area, another country, another tribe back then, you can't be treacherous. You have to stick to your word. And as Muslims being born in this country, our word is that we have to live by the rules of this country, as long as it's not forcing us to do something evil or bad, obviously, which applies to all people of conscience. But we have to stick by the rules. And by people committing acts of terrorism in this country, they not only breach the Islamic prohibition against killing civilians, but they also breach the Islamic prohibition against obviously committing acts of criminality. And the thing is this: we will stop these criminals from doing this if you can tell us the secret of how you stop crime in society. If you can tell us how to stop crime in society, how to eliminate all crime in society, and give us that secret, we will gladly apply it.
Let's try and be specific. One example is the the famous one that the press seem to attach on to, who I haven't brought up, and in my questions that I wrote before this, I didn't mention him, but someone like Anjan Chowdhury, not one Muslim stands across the road from him and voices their complaints about him in public. You know, and that's just one example.
Well, I mean, because basically he's so obscure, ignore him. We ignore him. He doesn't deserve. I mean, for some of the antics that he's done, those antics do not deserve the time of day from anybody. And if no one gave him the time of day, no one would know he even existed in the first place.
He can radicalise people who go out and kill people, and you don't feel he deserves the time of day.
Well, okay. I mean, he himself says that he never exhorts his followers to commit to acts of terrorism. And if he did, I'm pretty sure the Secret Services. No, I'm just saying I'm pretty sure the Secret Services would arrest him. And if they haven't arrested him, then that's a problem with the Secret Services that we have to ask questions about.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about Secret. I'm talking about other Muslims.
As I said, the Secret Services, they're the ones. I mean, if someone is inciting people to commit acts of terrorism in this country, then it's the job of the police and the Secret Services to protect the public.
I'm sorry, if somebody in the EDL said they were going to blow up a mosque, I would call the police.
Sure.
And so why aren't you or other Muslims standing up against someone like Anjan Chowdhury, who's radicalising young, impressionable people and getting them to go out there and commit abhorrent acts?
Well, first and foremost, as I said, we don't know that he's radicalizing because he claims that he actually claims publicly that he's against acts of terrorism in his country. So he says that he doesn't. But that's not the issue that we have. That's not our major issue. The major issue is his idea about, for example, establishing Sharia in the UK, which we just think it's absurd. And I mean, there are Christians who talk about establishing biblical law in the UK, but I don't think they're going to get very far. Or the Westboro Baptist Church in America.
What would be the main message coming out of mosques today about Sharia law?
Well,
would there be a consistent message that comes from the British Muslim Council, or are mosques very individualistic in their thinking?
Well, I mean, Sharia, the core aspects of Sharia, and the core aspects of the laws and ideas obviously are agreed upon. And the smaller issues around it are subject to difference of opinion, which is fine and healthy in any society to have difference of opinion amongst themselves. We don't have one central authority like a Catholic Church or something like this to set this is what established doctrine is or not. To some degree, that gives us some strength to have that plurality of opinions. But
and is that also perhaps one of your weaknesses, that it does allow radicals to say things, and therefore the whole group is tarnished by individuals saying things separately?
No, because if people want to be divergent, they're going to be divergent. I mean, Protestant Christianity came from being divergent from Catholic Church. So it just goes to show that if people want to be divergent, there's no power on heaven and earth, so to speak, short of God, that can actually stop them from going their wayward ways. So we can't stop that. And in any society, you're going to have people who have certain psychosis, certain mental problems that will kind of give them the proclivity of committing acts of violence. So in America, for example, abortion clinics are blown up by wayward Christians. People go into gay bars with shotguns. Christians go into gay bars and shoot, gay people as they call it. Which doesn't represent.
Hang them.
Sorry.
Whereas Muslims in countries state-sanctioned hangings for gay people. So.
Well, I mean, as I said, the countries that in the Muslim world today, they are post-colonial creations.
Let's leave all those particular issues as we draw things to a close. Perhaps we could finish with one final question.
Sure.
Which is, in an ideal world in Britain, what would you like to see develop in Britain in an ideal world over the next 10, 20, 30 years for Britain with the Muslim community? What would you like to see? Okay, well, I think first and foremost, in an ideal world, I'd want the media to completely, preferably just ignore the Muslim community, focus on the more important problems that they're out there. I would hope that there'd be understanding to know that Muslims are humans like anybody else. They have the same concerns, the same desires. The Muslim community, obviously, I want them to go about to be able to practice their religion, not impose on others and have no one else impose their beliefs on them. So everyone, in a way, can live their own way of life as they see fit.
no imposition, and not feel pressured or persecuted or witch hunted or baited by social forces, by media, and so on. So this is what I'd like to see. I'd like to see people being able to live according to their conscience, according to their beliefs, not imposing on anybody else, but also preferably with greater understanding of everyone else's beliefs and ideas, so that you can interact and have meaningful interactions and amicable interactions with other people.
Okay, thank you. And Gary, what would you like to see in Britain in this ideal world in the next 10, 20 years?
I would like to see Muslims in Britain stand up to the extreme components in Islam. For example, female genital mutilation, which has become rife in our country. I'd like to see things like halal labelled. I'd like to see Muslims standing up to mosques. For example, in the recent Undercover ITV documentary, where 18 out of 52 mosques agreed to marry a 14-year-old child to an adult man. And I'm sure if the rest of the mosques actually knew the undercover reporter, it may have been more than 18 that said yes. But I haven't seen any Muslims call for those imams to be taken from those mosques. I haven't heard any Muslims say that those mosques should be closed down. I would like to see anyone who comes to this country to conform to British values and not bring with them components of their own ideology that are a threat to our country and our way of life and our identity. And these are not imagined threats, they're very real. And if the Muslim communities in Britain can do that and they can conform to British values and integrate with British life, then as with other communities like the Afro-Caribbean communities, some of the Hindu communities and Sikhs and Jewish communities who've settled in with British life very well, you know, there's no conflict with them. Why is there a conflict with Islam and with Muslims in Britain? It's not something imagined. It's a very real threat to our country and our way of life.
Okay, we're just going to have the last 10 minutes focusing on one or two key issues and to try and see whether between Gary and Abdullah we can find some common ground here in Britain today. Gary, I think you've identified that there's some quite specific issues that's happened recently within our country that people are offended about and don't understand and might be judging or misunderstanding the Islamic community by those actions. Do you want to just tell us one or two things that really has drawn real concern to you recently?
Recently there was an Undercover ITV documentary where 52 mosques where the undercover reporter was a lady wearing a hijab or a burqa. She went in and spoke to the imam and asked if her 14-year-old daughter could marry a 22-year-old male. And out of the 52 mosques, 18 said yes, it was no problem because it's okay in Islam. A lot of us feel that if the mosque has actually known that undercover reporter, it probably would have been more than just 18 mosques that said yes. But even those 18 mosques, when you take child marriage into consideration and forced marriage and what we've seen with Muslim grooming gangs in court almost every week all over the North and the Midlands in England, there seems to be something endemic there that's based on either the culture or motivated within the religion. Either way, it's something that's abhorrent to our country and it needs to be addressed.
Of course, we have to recognise the publicity recently has been huge on child abuse within our country, which is, of course, fairly general across all cultures. But Abdullah, what is the Muslim answer to that in a British culture with the British law about someone of that age marrying a 14-year-old? It's clearly against the British law.
I would say that basically, I mean, even in Muslim countries, women tend to be married off at an age roughly approximate to what women in the UK and so on. Sometimes you might say early 20s and so on and so forth, and that's kind of the accepted kind of traditional age. So I think for Muslims, I mean, early marriage or marriage at 13 or 14. Now, I mean, we'd raise an eyebrow at that as much as anyone else would. However, I think there's been a kind of, you could say, a lost in translation kind of cultural aspect. Now, this is very rarely practiced in the Muslim community because most people would say, what's the point of it? But it's not really child marriage. It's more of a betrothal, where basically a family or parent or father or mother even wants to betroth their child to another child, and they'd hope that basically they'd bring their families closer together, and hopefully that the children would still agree to it when they become adults, and then they would consent, and then it could be a proper marriage. It would be a proper marriage with the physical aspects of a proper marriage once they've passed the age of consent and they are adults. Now, I mean, I think that a lot of it, the problem is obviously lost in translation. I mean, betrothal is voluntary. It doesn't really mean anything anyway, because until two consenting adults give their consent, there is no actual marriage, and they can't consummate the marriage, and so on. So that doesn't go against the law, but rather, and which is why you will not see people arrested for that practice, because there is no consummation, there is no physical intercourse, which is what the law prohibits in this country. Although we could raise questions with the current culture we see in the West, and many people have raised this in the UK as well. It's illegal, sure, but it happens where young teenagers, even 12 or 11, are having sex at that age with each other in this country. It's becoming more and more prominent. No, I didn't. I explained it. I said that it's a issue of lost in translation. There's not actual marriage. It's not an actual marriage.
That's not true.
It's betrothal. There is no consummation of marriage. There is no moving in or any of that stuff.
Did you watch that undercover show on OTV?
Yes, I watched the undercover show.
And did you see the imam say?
And that wasn't the first documentary about it either. There's been a whole number.
But did you see the imam clearly say to the lady, the undercover reporter, that it'd be no problem for them to move into the house together? That goes against what you just said, doesn't it?
Well, as I said, I mean, generally speaking, with betrothals, they don't move into the house with each other. But even if they did move into the same house, as long as there is no intercourse, as long as the parents of that child give consent, it's not actually against the law. It's odd, it's strange, yes, but it's not actually against British law or Sharia law. But it's strange, of course. Yes, I find it a bit odd, but it's not breaking the law. And the issue here we're trying to look at is what breaks the law. There are people who basically they let their child live with another family, or maybe orphans will live with another family. I mean, it's not strange for a child living in a house which is not their biological parents, but I'd find it odd in that circumstance, but it's not breaking the law, and that's what we need to look at.
I think the one thing that perhaps
an indefensible position. That's just.
No, because
what you're saying flies in the face of British values. It's wrong.
No, because the law is what we look at, right? You said this. We have to respect British law, and in that situation, as long as no law breaking has occurred, as long as intercourse would only happen between two consenting adults,
but that's not the
case. That's what we look at. Well, if there is any case, and I don't think that show didn't say that. The show didn't say that it happened, or that the imam didn't encourage them to do it.
A young girl move in with a young man.
It's betrothal. Many cultural practice. It's a cultural practice, not just amongst some parts of the Muslim world. It's in other parts.
It's an Eastern practice, isn't it?
Yeah, it even used to be an old English practice back in the day. In fact, maybe you could say that's British values.
2 years ago, there was in Bradford another documentary involving a retired police captain who talked about 2,000 plus cases of forced marriage with children from the Pakistani community. So.
Forced marriage is against Sharia law and all the laws that I know of. You can't force someone to be married. There was a case when a girl approached the Prophet Muhammad and he asked her. She said to him, "My father forced me to get married to my husband," and so the Prophet said, "Do you know? Okay, I'll grant you divorce." And she said, actually said, no, I actually like my husband, but it was for the principle. And that established that case established a precedence that basically you cannot force anyone to be married in Islam or anywhere else. And we condemn it as much as
perhaps you don't understand British values. I mean, if an adult marries a child, that is considered forced marriage. And whether you agree with that or not, that's the way we feel.
Well, I mean, as I said, I don't think Muslims could go to the local registry and have underage marriage. I don't think that would be accepted. Of course not, right? But we're not discussing that. We're discussing forced marriages in the sense which happens whereby a girl or a man or a boy is forced to get married to someone else. Sometimes it's from someone back home. It doesn't just happen in the Muslim community. It happens. It seems to predominate in the Asian subcontinent. So it's not only related to. It's not related to Muslims per se as a religion.
Yeah.
It's related to actually just a local.
Yeah, there's a specific
local
problem.
Let me
in
just
India and
draw us on
Pakistan,
here because
but
we're going to have to close in a moment. Gary, if there's one thing you want to see from the Muslim community, what is it?
I want to see people standing against things that we consider wrong, people that we can cheer for, people that we can embrace as part of British culture and British life,
Right. Yes.
that want to integrate with British life. And when, for example, groups like Need for Khalifa do a campaign for self-rule in Bradford or something ridiculous like that, I want to see Muslim people stand up to them, and I want to see people that we can cheer for, that want to be part of Britain, that don't want their separate lives and their separate states almost.
Yes.
And there's been several campaigns like that, but you hardly see anyone standing against it apart from the English.
Yes. Abdullah, have we just missed them, or does the Muslim community lack key leaders that can be recognised? Clearly, we don't control the press. But are there key leaders who are speaking out against injustices in this country?
As I said earlier on, by the thousands on all levels. It's just that you won't hear them because it's not newsworthy.
So
it's
where
sensationalism
do we
itself.
need to find them then, Abdullah, for the to build relationships here? Gary said he's looking for a cheerleader from the Muslim community.
They're
who's
just
speaking
a
out.
Google
Where
search
do we
away.
find them?
They're just a Google search away. You
Sorry,
you
I'm sorry, we
hadn't
know-
even
we
done a
know-
Google search on it.
We know how to use the internet.
All right,
If there were such people, we would be posting about them because we'd think, oh, they're on the side of the British people.
Well, I'll give you an example, right? So, for example, I've engaged with English Defence League before, right? And I condemn a lot of their what they are concerned about. I've made public my condemnations. Yet they still called me an extremist, and they still called me a fundamentalist, and so on. So even Muslims who are condemning these things, you will condemn. But there was something you said I think is very important. When you said, what do we want from the Muslim community? And you said, we want them to condemn things that we think are wrong. That is wrong. Because you can't define for other people what they should consider to be wrong. The issue that we should be concerned with is that law and order is maintained.
People should stand up for what they think is right and wrong.
But you can't impose your understanding of right and wrong on someone else. That's the problem. That's where the imposition happens. That's where you're forcing. What if I said?
But you're both saying, aren't you? It seems to me, you're both saying that actually Muslims and non-Muslims should obey the British law as it stands today.
Yeah, they should not commit acts of criminality, violence, killing, stealing, all that stuff. They should obey that law. It's as if you live in this country, you're under in Islam, and according to Sharia, we believe we're under a covenant, and we make a covenant with the country, or as Rousseau would say, a contract citizen, a contract with the country, that we will abide by the laws in return for security and protection, which is what the state does. And that is the limit of what we should be expecting from Muslims. If you say, but I have my personal tastes,
we'll leave it there.
Sorry, but our laws are based in what we consider right and wrong. So how do you differentiate between the two?
Well, as I said, as long as Muslims are happy to obey the law, as long as we're not forced. For example, if the law said everyone must eat pork, that would be a problem. That would be then Muslims would be exactly. So all laws which are basically conscionable, and generally most laws are, don't commit violence, stealing, murder, and so on and so forth. These laws that we all have to follow, and we all have to obey. And if we followed these laws, and we didn't impose on each other, you'd be surprised at how well society can actually get on. As long as we don't have a problem, we only have a problem if we make it a problem.
Well, on that one point that we do agree, that we believe in obeying the laws at this current time, Abdullah and Gary, thank you very much for contributing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Nice to meet you.
Well done. Good to hear.